This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.
Floods, fire, drought and storms. It seems every day brings a new story about the impact of extreme weather events. Aside from the physical loss and emotional impact on individuals and communities, extreme weather events also have legal implications for organisations and people. In this Hall & Wilcox's latest podcast series, we'll examine some of these legal issues, ranging from planning and environment through to retail and supply chain, amongst others. My name is Mark Dunphy and I'm a partner at Hall & Wilcox. Joining me today, I'm delighted to have my fellow partners and colleagues from our planning and environment teams, Meg Lee and Brendan Tobin. Please join me in welcoming Meg and Brendan. Now, the planning framework has a huge role to play in both forward planning for and responding to extreme weather events. The topic of climate change and attributing certain events to climate change is also relevant in considering how planning and environmental laws are accommodating climate change or otherwise. Meg, I'd like to start with planning if we could. Could you give us an overview of the role that town planning plays when we're forward planning for extreme weather, and perhaps some observations about to the extent that may have changed over time?
Yeah, sure, Mark, and thank you for hosting today. Look, the planning framework has a really important role to play, and as you point out, it has evolved over time in response to climate change. So from planning policy, which sort of sits at the top of the planning scheme framework, down to things like flood overlay controls, it has a really important role to play in building resilience into our buildings and placemaking, and ensuring that climate change is considered at the outset of planning for new suburbs across Melbourne's outer ring, or new buildings or refurbishing. So in the Victorian scheme, for example, there's a really broad state policy that's been introduced in recent years that has the overall objective of minimising the impacts of natural hazards and adapting to the impacts of climate change through risk-based planning. So that's a really important sort of framework that's set at the beginning of the planning policy. It includes strategies that then need to be implemented as planning authorities make decisions about future developments. And that's, granting permits or doing planning scheme amendments. So some of those strategies are things like the requirement to direct population growth and development to low risk locations, to develop adaptation and response strategies for existing settlements in risk areas to accommodate change over time. So, for example, seaside settlements that are going to be liable to more flooding in the future.
That's an interesting question with regard, and that's a great example, I guess, of how planning needs to change to the environment, because what was fit for purpose from a planning scenario maybe 100 years ago might be very different for a seaside location now. How does that work, Meg, in terms of the ability to change a planning scheme to accommodate, for instance, a rising sea level in a coasting community, and what sort of that may suit some people who want to move into an area, it may not suit incumbents in an area? How do planning authorities balance the needs of the old with the needs of the new?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's not easy. But what has been going on at the moment in Victoria is there is a requirement that was introduced into the state policy to plan for sea level rise of not less than 0.8 metres by 2100. So that's the climate modelling says that's going to be our sea level rise. And for planning authorities to start to do that planning now, and to allow for the combined effects of tides and storm surges and coastal processes when looking at risks. So what the planning authorities, jointly with the water authorities, have been doing is starting to introduce new flood overlays that look at where those floods will be in 2100. So, and starting to build into the planning system requirements to develop buildings that can adapt to that future sea level rise. And it's causing some real issues in terms of that long-term planning.
What about issues for buildings that have already been planned and approved and have been there for a long time and may be impacted by rising tide, for instance? how does that play out in a planning context? Can they have changes imposed on how they need to use their properties?
Yeah, look, it's really only triggered, the planning system really only comes in to play when someone's applying for a new development. So it is interesting. We've just been doing a planning scheme amendment at the moment for some property owners along the Yarra River in Melbourne. And the overlay that's being brought in there, or proposed to be brought in there by Melbourne Water and the City of Melbourne, is imposing this new flood overlay that's based on the 2100 levels. So there's some developers there that are proposing to, refurbish those sites, so they will be caught up potentially in this new requirements. But others that aren't planning on refurbishing yet, nothing will trigger a requirement for them to do anything. It's really only about, if you're refurbishing, you need to raise your floor levels and plan for that future flood event.
And what role, Meg, do water authorities play?
Yeah, look, Melbourne Water has all water authorities have a really important role to play in doing that flood modelling. So they're really the responsible entity, statutory authority that is looking at doing that forward planning, doing the modelling, and they set in both the planning framework and the building framework, they set the finished floor levels for buildings. So it's sort of a blunt tool that says, this is the level you've got to set your building at to deal with future flooding. But they're also responsible under the Water Act for doing that future planning on a more precinct basis, and that's what some of the developers are saying. We can't expect each ad hoc development to sort of go up 1.4 metres when the next one isn't going up 1.4 metres because they're not redeveloping. So how do you sort of look at a whole precinct, and with the Yarra River and the important sort of thoroughfare that is, and a tourist attraction along the promenade, perhaps we need to be doing some more precinct planning rather than this sort of ad hoc response whenever someone applies for a permit.
And do you think that's where we're headed for being more an objective overlay rather than looking at things on application by application?
Look, I think both are really important. And another example, I guess, is building standards and building in ESD requirements, sort of to respond to not just flooding, but extreme temperatures, and to make our built environment more sustainable, and to use more solar energy and all those sorts of things built into the built environment. So there's sort of there's really important stuff that can be done at the planning level on the one-off basis, and then there's this strategic planning that's really important as well.
Terrific. Brendan, over to you. What do you see as the role of climate change in when it comes to planning decisions, and the extent to which it is impacting on decisions?
Thanks, Mark. It's certainly one increasingly contributing factor is climate change. It's often said that you can't attribute one extreme weather event to climate change. I think that view is starting to fall away, and bushfire seasons happening in year after year, places of the country burning which have never burned before, that it's becoming less justified that you can just dismiss an extreme weather event as being one-off. These weather events are being driven by climate change. And so, to follow on from Meg's point, the government needs to be, through planning laws and zoning and all those requirements, be much more systematic about how it deals with the impacts of climate change and severe weather events, because they will continue to happen on a more frequent basis. So I think that argument is changing. The second thing that we're seeing in respect to planning and environmental laws, Mark, is the role of climate change and impact on people's human rights. So both Victoria and Queensland have legislated human rights, and there is at the international level human rights obligations. And an example of this was the recent decision of the United Nations Human Rights Commission that decided that the Australian government had done not enough to mitigate the impacts of climate change on a number of Torres Strait Islanders, the Torres Strait 8 they were. And those mitigation measures were principally the building of seawalls to protect lives. So that claim was upheld. We're also seeing human rights arguments being interposed into other planning and environment decisions, particularly in relation to new fossil fuel projects. So climate change is really driving change in planning, and people are not sitting back and waiting for the government. They're certainly using the laws to drive change. The second thing really is that planning will need to accommodate is displaced people as a result of climate change. And the government has not only announced to build 1 million new homes by 2030, but there will be whole communities which will be displaced as a result of climate change, not just in Australia, in places like the Torres Strait, but also the Pacific Islands and parts of Asia. So the planning really needs to accommodate where are these new communities going to need to be accommodated.
And in the Pacific Islands, there are obvious examples of islands and whole countries potentially ceasing to exist almost. In Australia, I guess it's really in the northern tips, the northern extremities, where that's more likely to be an issue.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. So as part of the land court case that we've been running in Queensland, we went to 2 islands in the Torres Strait, Erub and Porrima, to hear evidence on country there about the effect of climate change. And the issue in that case was it was a coal project in central Queensland, and they were drawing the link between the coal, which would be extracted from the coal mine, which would be burnt, which would increase greenhouse gas emissions, which would exacerbate climate change and the impacts of climate change, like sea level rises, which would devastate some of these countries. I mean, the island of Porrima is probably only 5 metres above sea level. These impacts are almost locked in already. And these are people who've lived on these islands for thousands of years. It's their home. They don't want to be moved. So those climate change impacts are very real and upon us in Australia, not just in the Pacific Islands. That's right, Mark.
Thank you. Meg, can we turn to looking at the role that planning in particular plays in responding after extreme weather events such as bushfires or floods? I guess to date we've been looking at how it's impacting on decisions, maybe in a more theoretical sense, but let's turn to look at how it responds after an event.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, it's got a really crucial role to play in the rebuilding process after a fire or a flood has gone through an area. We often see images on the television of people living in caravans and temporary accommodation for a long time while they wait for their rebuild, and partly that will be insurance issues, but planning is one of the obviously the regulatory processes people have to deal with after an extreme event, and the time it can take to get a planning approval is a frustration for many developers, but let alone people who have lost their homes in these extreme events. And what happens really is that you've had houses in an area that is exposed to this extreme event that perhaps have been there for a long time and were built at a time when building standards didn't really think about bushfire protection, but now there's really quite detailed requirements known as the BEL requirements for bushfire prone areas. So when people go to rebuild, there's all these new requirements that make it quite expensive and difficult to get planning approval. And similarly in the flooding context, if there's a new flood overlay that's gone in since your house was built, you've now got to raise your floor levels and deal with flood resilience as well. And there's probably a good case study in Victoria when we had the bushfires, the Wye River fires, and the whole of Wye River basically was wiped out. And then, of course, on that steep slope, they had flooding and erosion and lots of things to deal with all at once. And the state government, together with the Colac Otway Shire, set up a fast track sort of triage process to help people get through the planning and building process quickly. And that included some exemptions, but also tailored sort of bushfire mitigation measures for the new dwellings. And they did an overall assessment of the area rather than each person having to do their own bushfire assessment. So they tried to make it more efficient and cheaper to get through the process and faster. And it worked really well. It's a really good case study of how planning can, adapt and help in a crisis like that.
Would you anticipate that a similar fast track triage sort of process could be set up to deal with issues arising out of the events in Maribyrnong in Melbourne recently, or in the towns outside of outside of Melbourne in Victoria that have been devastated over the last month or so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I think the planning system it does have processes for being able to do that and to work with the different authorities. Planning really brings together lots of aspects. So as you mentioned, water authorities. There's different referral authorities like the fire, the CFA that have a role in approving the building standards to do with protection from bushfires. So yeah, triaging is a really important sort of process.
Brendan, what about the experience in New South Wales?
A couple of examples I can give you, Mark. Through our pro bono efforts, we're assisting a gentleman that lost his property on the mid-north coast in the 2019 bushfires, and a remote property, steep location, poor access, and he can't raise the funds or doesn't have the funds in order to build a new house which would be compliant with bushfire standards, driveway access to get a fire tanker in there. And so those more onerous requirements, which are understandable, so for property preservation and also for his life, essentially mean that he can't afford to rebuild. So that displaces him. The second example is we're doing a case in Lismore at the moment. It's an appeal against, in respect to a new housing estate, and there's a real tension there because Lismore, which suffered 2 severe floods in back to back at the start of the year and almost faced a third one a month or so ago, has a clear need for housing, but and potentially to move people out of that flood zone. But the question is, well, where do you put them? And generally, you need to put them in locations which will cause other environmental planning issues. For instance, they'll displace koala habitat, or they'll displace some threatened species, or they'll require traffic upgrades and electrical upgrades. So it's not easy to relocate these people, and it has flow-on consequences. And that's really, I suppose, the planning system needs to probably catch up as to where do you move these people to, and where are properly located sites that will still have other impacts, whether they're ecological or people's loss of views, or moving people into locations that provide separation between 2 towns that are now essentially going to be connected. So they're really the examples we're seeing in New South Wales, Mark.
Thank you. Good examples in both states. I guess we've been discussing so far, Megan, Brendan, planning decisions that are being made at a very local level. Although Brendan, you certainly spoke about the impact on Pacific Islands as well. I'm interested in, at a federal level, the way that the government respond, and particularly perhaps in the budget, anything that they're looking at allocating towards climate change, adaptation, and where any money they're directing through the budget is going to go and how it will filter down.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to start with that, Mark. There was obviously a lot of announcements in the budget relating to climate change, given we've committed to net zero. So it's exciting to see. It will be interesting to see, how that sort of filters down and works in practice. But there was, I think, 47 million for the new Climate Change Authority to do with a lot of things, hopefully, including to provide independent advice. So that'll be part of the, looking at the modelling and the impacts, and hopefully doing a lot of mapping and working out where the greatest impacts are. And, you mentioned, Mark, that it might just be the far north in Australia, but it's actually all our coastal areas are potentially liable to, and that's where our populations are. There's been some recent flood work done down in the Port Fairy area, and there's, the whole of that sort of town is potentially going to need to move as well. So a lot of that money will be spent on that sort of research side of things. A lot of it will be spent on reporting. So under the new Act, there's requirements to report, and that will be a really important part of sort of tracking how we're going. There's also, I think, about 10 million for climate risk and opportunity management program, which will look at focusing on climate risk assessment and resilience. And importantly, quite a lot of money allocated, about 15 million, to look at working with First Nations people, which I think is something that is really important in looking at climate change, both the impacts of climate change on country and also learnings from Indigenous groups about how to deal with climate change better. Things like savanna bushfire management is going to be a big part of our creating offsets and Australian carbon credit units. You can do that by this technique, and we're looking at a project at the moment for a client where they'll work with an Indigenous land council and look at managing the bushfire risk and doing early burning, which actually means that rather than having a later season fire and releasing a lot more carbon into the atmosphere, if you manage that burning earlier, you actually can get a carbon credit from that. So working with Indigenous people and their knowledge of landscape, I think, is a really important part of our response to climate change and dealing with extreme events.
Thank you. Brendan, you mentioned earlier about your experience in visiting the Torres Straits and your involvement up there. Wondering if you had any further observations you'd like to make about directly seeing the impact of climate change through your own eyes, as opposed to, seeing it in a theoretical way or reported on television.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite stark, really. These communities that have developed on what essentially island or coral cays and that have developed over thousands of years, and how exposed to climate change they are. And it's encouraging that at least this federal government is taking some leadership on the issue. And generally, environmental planning laws have been a state issue, and those decisions are made at a state level. So it will be interesting to see how the federal government responds to calls for a climate trigger in the Commonwealth environmental laws. But yeah, it's pretty stark.
And I wonder, maybe either Meg or Brendan, if you know the answer to this, that whilst it's great to see the federal government providing assistance to First Nations communities and leveraging off their experiences and looking at their particular issues, is the Australian government assisting the Pacific Islands, our Pacific neighbours, as well, and particularly the smaller islands and atolls who aren't as well resourced in terms of both research and in managing the impacts of rising tides on their well-being and countries?
I think the focus so far, Mark, has really been on Australia, and particularly those low-lying islands in the Torres Strait, particularly in the context that there's been a number of human rights cases which are being taken against the Commonwealth. So I think that's been their focus. But certainly one of, I think, Penny Wong's first trips was to the Pacific Islands. So I think we will see more action there, particularly in the lower-lying islands like Tuvalu, which they will be unlikely to be there in 50 years. That's just the reality of it. So
very sad, beautiful countries. Okay, well, I want to thank you both, Meg and Brendan, for joining me today, and thank you to everybody who has taken the time to listen to this podcast. We trust you find the information useful in this episode, and please reach out to us if you have any questions that arise. Please feel free to reach out to either myself or Meg or Brendan, and details will be provided. You can find the details on our website at hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review and follow our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can subscribe on our website to be notified of new episodes. Thank you very much.